Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. How about a nice pine chest to store your fine linens? Now down in Georgia they call them a dough box, and I'll tell you why next, right here on the new Yankee Workshop.
The new Yankee Workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram.
Well, once again we're in the low country of Georgia, but the piece I want to show you today didn't come from down here. The owner purchased it out of an antique shop in Ohio, not far from Cincinnati. Now, she calls it a dough box. Bread dough would be prepared, put in the box to rise, and I imagine later it would be made into loaves right on the top. Now, here in this beautiful kitchen, it's being used as an occasional table. But I could see using it for a TV, a lamp, or even flowers. Now, it's made out of pine and it's aged beautifully. A couple boards for the top, couple boards for the front and back, joined together with a tongue and groove joint and let into the side panel. Now if you look at the side panel closely, you can see it's splayed a little bit wider at the top, tapering down. You can also imagine that if you look at this decorative cutout, a horseshoe. Therefore the side panel is called a horseshoe end. Now let's take a look on the inside. There's a lot of good storage room. Here it's being used to store table linens. You want to put things in here that you don't need every day because you'll have to take whatever's on the top off to get to it. The sides are put together with a cleat, again some tongue and groove joints. And look at this, some gnawing. Perhaps a mouse was trapped in the flour or in the dough trying to get out. Now this piece could be 100 or 150 years old. Simple and very useful. I think we should build a couple. Well, let's see how the bread dough is doing. Hey, it's not rising at all. Just kidding. There's no bread dough in here. I think that this chest on legs will be much more useful for me to store my fine linens than for the bread dough. Anyway, I'm not much of a baker. Now, our prototype is pretty true to the antique original we found in Georgia. Only a couple changes. One is that the ends are made of two boards glued together rather than held together with a cleat. Another is that I hinged the top so that it would be easier to get in and out of the bin. Now, whether you're a baker or a woodworker or you need a place to store your linens, you might want to build one of these. And we have a measured drawing with the materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. I built our piece out of antique pine to give it that nice look. One of the advantages of antique pine is that if you look at it, you can see how close these growth rings are together. That gives me a stable board. That also means that this timber might very well have come from virgin forest that were once all over the east coast of the United States. The other thing is that I get a nice color, which finishes nicely. I could have used new pine, but if you look at new pine, it's very white in color. The growth rings are very far apart, which means the board could cup and curl in time. And we find that when you apply a finish, sometimes it's very blotchy. Now, to get old boards, we've been saving timber from renovation projects for the last few years. Instead of going in the dumpster, they come here to the shop. We stack them up carefully, often putting little cleats in between to leave an air space so that the boards will dry and stay nice and flat. To get the boards from that stage to usable wood takes a bit of effort. The first thing to do is to remove all the iron, usually nails, sometimes bolts. These will do a lot of damage to your saw blade and your planer. Now, some of them you can see, but when you can't see the metal, it's useful to have one of these. We bought it at a specialty store that supplies security devices to the airline industry. Turn it on, and as you come across the board, when you meet iron, it sends off an alarm. The next step is to get the metal out. One tool is this nail puller. And you slip it over the head of the nail, drive the handle down, and it pivots and grabs it, pulling it out. Makes easy work. May cause a little damage, but if you're using the other side of the board, doesn't matter. Otherwise, you need an awl to pry around the nail to make room to grab it. You can either use these side cutting pliers to grab on and pull it out, wire cutters, or even locking pliers. Any of these tools will do the job. Once all the iron is removed, I then rip off the bad material, giving me boards a little wider and longer than I need. Then it's off to the surface planer. One of the things I've found about these antique timbers is that they vary in thickness one board to the other. In fact, sometimes a board will be thicker on one end than it is at the other. So the first thing I do is measure the thickest board. In this case, it's about 1 inch. So I'm going to set my planer at 15/16. Before we do any use of the power tools, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. And of course, hearing protection when necessary. Okay, we're pretty close. You could still take a little bit more off. This time I'm going to lower down only a 32nd of an inch and run the same side through again. Good. Okay. All the boards now have a clean side. Now we'll clean the other side until they're 3/4 of an inch thick. From the sound of it, we may need to empty our barrel. Yep, it looks like it's full. Now, people often ask how we keep the New Yankee workshop so clean, and part of the secret is this machine right here, a 5-horsepower dust and chip collector. All the material is brought here through a series of pipes. The heavy material falls in this barrel, and the flour falls in another barrel. Now, when we're planing, we make plenty of this, and I don't throw it out. Every bit of it gets bagged and sent off to a local poultry farmer. To get panels this wide, it's necessary to glue boards together. In the case of the top, there are 3 boards in this one, and the ends are made up of 2 boards. The process starts by looking at the boards for the best face. Here I have 2 that will become the top of the one we're working on today. If you flip this one over, you can see that we didn't quite get the board cleaned down, and the reason for that was that I didn't want the boards to be any thinner. Plus, I'm going to trim some of this off, so we'll just sand the rest of the material out, but obviously it has to face down. If we look at this board, this side is nice, but it doesn't match very well in color or texture. If I flip it over, it's just about a perfect match. Now, in the ideal world, I would like to alternate the growth rings on each of these boards. So this one curving up, this one curving down. That way I get stability in the top. But in this case, and especially with these old timbers, I'm going to end up with 2 boards with the rings curling up. Best face wins. The next step is to clean up this joint where we're going to glue it up. And the best tool for that is the joiner. Even though my joiner has a positive stop to assure that the fence is 90 degrees to the table, it doesn't hurt to check it once in a while. A good cabinet maker's square is the perfect tool. Otherwise, you could end up with jointed edges that are beveled, and the piece won't be flat when you glue it up. Okay, let's see how that looks. That is good. Now we're going to lay out for some biscuits to reinforce the joint. My boards are a 1/2 inch longer on each end than I need for the blank. So I'm going to come in the 1/2 for trimming and then another 2 inches for the first biscuit. And that'll assure that the biscuit is not going to show on the end. 2.5 inches in from the other end. And then about every 8 inches on center. The slot that I'm going to cut is going to be for a number 10 biscuit. I have a couple accessories which make glue-ups easier to do. One is this roller, which allows me to roll on a nice even coat of glue along the edge of the board. And the other is this metering tool which puts the right amount of glue in each biscuit slot. These biscuits are actually made out of beechwood, and the orientation of the grain makes them strong. Plus, moisture makes them swell, securing the joint. The clamp pressure that I need is really just enough to bring the joint together. I don't want to squeeze all the glue out. After it's clamped, we'll just set it aside to dry. Here's a blank that's already been cured, and it was glued up the same way as we did with the top. It's going to become one of the ends of the dough box. The first step is to square up one end. To do that, I'm going to use my homemade panel cutter, a piece of 3/8 inch thick plywood with a fence along the front and a hardwood strip on the bottom, which rides in the miter gauge slot of the saw. The strip is perpendicular to the saw blade, so as I guide the tool through the saw, I get a perfect 90-degree cut. Now that one end is square and straight, I can set it against my fence and trim it to length. If you look at the prototype, the cutout for the legs kind of reminds me of a horseshoe. So the first thing I did was make a template out of 1/4 inch plywood, which is the shape of the leg, including the notch for the sideboards. Now I can take the template to lay out my blanks. This blank, I have some special considerations. I have a loose knot and a split that I don't want to be part of the end. I'd like to include this knot, but not have it on the edge of the leg. I want it more or less in the center. So I'm going to take the blank, set it over the knot, hold it flush to the bottom, and then up against a framing square to make sure that it's square to the blank. Now I can trace the outline of the leg and the notch and give myself a center line from which I can just flip the template over and lay out the other side of the leg. My intention is to use the plywood template with my router to make the smooth curved cuts. But to take the pressure off the routing operation, I'm rough cutting with my jigsaw, staying about 1/16 of an inch away from the line. Now I'm attaching the template to the blank on the back side so that when I remove it, the screw holes won't show. I'm going to clamp it securely to my workbench so that I can route the curve smooth. To do the routing, I'm using my router, which is set up with a 1/2 inch flush trimming bit. The ball bearing at the end of the bit will ride on the plywood template, and the cutter will smooth up the wood. Let's look at the prototype again. The side panels are not square to the top. They angle in slightly at about 6 degrees. Now to make the cut on the end panel, I'm going to use my radial arm saw. I could make the cut freehand with a circular saw or with a straight edge and circular saw, but the radial arm gives me the most accurate results. I've turned the saw to 6 degrees beyond 0. We'll cut to the notch and finish it off with a hand saw. To ease the edges of the curved portion of the leg, I'm using a 1/4 inch quarter round bit, but I'm exposing just a little bit of the cutter, just to break the edge. Now I'm ready to make the front and back panels. And if you look closely, you can see that there are 2 boards joined with a tongue and groove joint, and it's not glued together. What we have here is an end panel that has grain running vertically, and front and back panels that have grain running horizontally. If I was to secure the panel firmly with glue, it might split with seasonal movement. By having a tongue and groove joint, I have some leeway for movement here. I have movement at the bottom and at the top. Let's make that tongue and groove joint. First, I'm going to make the groove, and to do that, I've set up my stacked dado head cutter for 1/4 of an inch, just the blades, no chipper. Set the height for 3/8 of an inch, and adjusted the fence so that it's approximately in the center of my boards. If I make 2 passes, one and then flip the board around and run it through, the groove will be perfectly centered. Now there's a sample of the tongue, and I'm going to try it in the groove, and that's a nice snug fit. Now to make the tongue, all I did was add a couple chippers to my stacked dado head set, add a sacrificial fence against my metal fence so that the blade won't hit it, reset the height, run the sample. Now we're ready to run the boards. Well, we're gaining on it. We'll easily finish this project tomorrow. Well, this morning we're ready to finish up the front and back panels. The bottom board of each panel can be left square because the notch is square. The panel flares out at about 6 degrees, so the top edge needs to be beveled so it'll be in the same plane as the end. To make that bevel, I've set up my table saw, tipping the blade to 6 degrees and setting the rip fence for about 15 1/16 inches. And I want to make sure that the face side of the panel sits on the saw. Now the saw cut that I just made is pretty smooth, but to make it perfect I'm going to run it through the joiner. So I've tipped the fence to 6 degrees and I'm going to remove the bevel board and run it through. And that takes care of trimming the front and back panels to length, just as I did with the end panels. Now is a good time to sand my panels, particularly the inside, because that'll be tough to get later. As I mentioned earlier, because of the cross-grain situation between the ends and the front and back panels, I don't want to secure this whole joint. I want to allow for movement. But I do have to secure it at some point, and I'm going to use a biscuit in the center of each board. With glue in all the slots and the biscuits installed, the tricky part now is to get it together and clamped without it falling apart. Okay, now we'll do the same thing to the other end. Here's my panel, which is going to be the bottom of the chest, and it needs to be beveled on both edges to fit into the bottom. So I've tipped my saw once again to 6 degrees. We'll run each edge. Now reset the fence to the final dimension and cut the other edge. The bottom panel is going to be supported by some cleats. There'll be one on each end that I've cut at a 6-degree bevel to match the slope of the front and back panel. I'm going to put a dab of glue right in the middle, because once again we have a cross-grain situation, so we don't want to glue the whole piece. You'll also note that I've cut the piece short of the front and back panels. That'll allow for some movement. One brad in the middle and one on each end. Now at the center of each front and back panel I have a short cleat that's been beveled at 6 degrees along the top edge, and I'll just brad that in place. A little dab of glue in the center of each end cleat, and on the side cleats I can actually glue the entire length. We'll pop the bottom in place and attach it with a couple brads. To remove the sharp corners of the top, I'm just rounding them with my belt sander. To mortise the hinges into the lid and into the box, I simply take the hinge, put it in the position that I want, and score the outline with a sharp utility knife. To remove the material, I'm going to use my router, which is set up with a 1/2-inch mortising bit. Now I'll just freehand it, getting as close to the line as possible, and then I'll clean up the rest with a sharp chisel. That's good. Once again, to ease the corners, I'm going to use a portion of my 1/4-inch rounding over bit. Now, there are a few defects that I want to repair. Not all of them, however. This knot that fell out I'm going to leave alone. Kind of reminds me of the mouse hole that was in the antique original. These smaller nail holes are no problem. They add a lot of character. But this big one's kind of a problem. I want to patch this using a process known as making a Dutchman. What I have is a piece of 1/4-inch plywood that I've cut out some classic Dutchman shapes. I set the template over the defect and clamp it in place. I'm going to make the Dutchman using my router with a special accessory. This collar right here. It fits into the router base. It has a 1/8-inch spiral cutting bit and a special collar. The collar rides on the inside of the template. Now I can make the corresponding patch that'll fit into the mortise. Here I've clamped a piece of scrap material and the template together to make the patch. All I have to do is remove the brass collar from my accessory, carefully drop it into the template, and cut a patch. Now that is going to fit perfectly into the mortise I made earlier. I'll just cut it out at the table saw. Just make a slight adjustment to my rip fence to get the patch to be approximately the same size as the mortise. Okay, now I just apply a little bit of glue to the mortise and to the patch, and just pop that in there, tap it down with a block of wood, and we'll just sand it flush. Then I think we're ready for the finishing room. I want to maintain as much of the character of my antique pine on the dough box as possible, so I've decided to use a solvent-based combination stain and urethane. And the advantage to this is that we only need to do things in one step. We'll put several coats on, and the manufacturer recommends that it's very important to keep a wet edge, keep moving along so that the stain won't be blotchy, and also to stir the product frequently so that the pigment doesn't settle out. After the first color coat dried, I sanded it with some 220 grit sandpaper. It's necessary to sand between coats to get a good bond. It's going to get darker with each coat, and I think it's going to take 3 coats before it gets to the shade that I want. You know, for years around here we've been looking for just the right finish for our antique pine timbers. And I think the combination of this stain and polyurethane has given us the best results yet. Makes the piece look like it's already 200 years old.